If you'd like to help support the channel, I'd greatly appreciate it. You can join the Patreon page, purchase something from the Teespring store, Etsy shop, and share the videos. It's your support that allows me to animate these battles. Thank you. The end of 1863 and into 1864 was a tumultuous time for both the Union and Confederate armies in the Eastern Theater. Commander of the Army of the Potomac, George Gordon Meade, was able to keep his army supplied well in northern Virginia. Railroads and waterways allowed supplies to pass into his lines, which boosted the morale of his army. Despite re-enlistments, his army was still depleted from the 1863 campaign season. 2 of his corps were detached for service in the West. He would combine the corps he still possessed into just 3. The 1st and 3rd Corps would be split up and divided amongst the other corps. What remained was the 2nd Corps under Winfield Scott Hancock, the 5th Corps under Governor K. Warren, and the 6th Corps under John Sedgwick. Soon the Army of the Potomac would be augmented by the return of the 9th Corps under Ambrose Burnside. That corps had been sent to Vicksburg, then took part in the East Tennessee campaign, before returning to the Eastern Theater and the Army of the Potomac. However, Burnside at one time commanded that army. By proper military hierarchy, he couldn't take orders from Meade, who was his junior in rank. That problem would be solved in the spring of 1864. Ulysses S. Grant, fresh off a string of victories at Vicksburg and Chattanooga, was promoted to lieutenant general, meaning he held rank over all commanders in the entire United States Army. Grant would make his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac. Burnside's 9th Corps would answer directly to Grant instead of Meade. When Grant came to Meade's headquarters, Meade feared that Grant would relieve him of command, and even told the new general-in-chief that if he felt the need to replace him, to not hesitate. Grant calmed the general's anxiety by stating that he didn't plan on replacing the army commander. However, Grant did replace his cavalry commander, Alfred Pleasonton. The cavalryman performed poorly and many were dissatisfied with his actions, so Grant removed him and replaced him with Philip Sheridan, whom Grant had known in the Western Theater. Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia was suffering that winter for a want of supplies, unlike their Union counterparts. Pleas to Richmond for food and equipment went unfulfilled. Lee's army had been depleted by illness, battles, and sending units to other theaters. James Longstreet and his 1st Corps had been sent west and helped Braxton Bragg win the Battle of Chickamauga, before clashing with Bragg and being sent to attack Burnside in East Tennessee. Longstreet failed to dislodge the Union forces around Knoxville and would return to Lee on April 20, 1864. Lee now had his 3 corps together, the 1st under Longstreet, the 2nd Corps under Richard S. Ewell, and the 3rd Corps under A.P. Hill, amounting to a little over 60,000 men. Grant possessed twice the number of Lee, and now that spring was beginning, Grant began to plan for the upcoming campaign. He and his friend William T. Sherman in northern Georgia would launch simultaneous attacks in May 1864, Sherman against Atlanta and Grant against Lee toward Richmond. In the Eastern Theater, Grant had 2 options. He could try to outflank Lee to the west, but it would be more difficult to supply his army going that route. If he assailed Lee's right flank, he could supply his army using railroads and waterways that crisscrossed the landscape. Easily he chose that route. The Rapidan River separated the 2 armies, and from atop Clark's Mountain, Lee and his corps commanders, Longstreet, Ewell, and Hill, overlooked the landscape below. Lee concluded that Grant would move against his right, and that when Grant moved, they would move. On the night of May 3rd, Grant and the Army of the Potomac began their movement against Lee's right flank, the 2nd Corps moving toward the crossing at Ely's Ford, and the 5th and 6th Corps at Germanna Ford. The 9th Corps was to wait on the north side of the Rapidan until called for by Grant. That night, Lee could see the flickering of the fires that indicated soldiers marching in front of the flames. Knowing that Grant was on the move, he now needed to know how many men were involved and where they were headed. He alerted Ewell and Hill to have their men prepared to march by morning. Reports soon came in that the Army of the Potomac was headed for Ely's and Germanna Fords. Leaving Richard Anderson's division of Hill's Corps and a few other units from Ewell's Corps to guard the original line, Lee ordered Hill and Ewell to the east, hoping to engage with Grant in the thick forest of the wilderness, where his numbers and superior artillery would mean less. Grant hoped to make it out of the wilderness and into the open to engage with Lee on more advantageous ground for himself. By the night of May 4th, Hancock's 2nd Corps encamped at Chancellorsville, and the other two corps encamped between Germanna Ford and the crossroads made by the Germanna Plank Road and the Orange Turnpike. Ewell's corps encamped on the Orange Turnpike and Hill's on the Orange Plank Road. Longstreet's corps had been called up by Lee, but it would be some time before he caught up to the other two corps. On the morning of May 5th, the two armies moved closer to one another. Philip Sheridan, the commander of Grant's cavalry, depleted the front of horsemen because he didn't want to disperse his men, plus he wanted to concentrate his forces against Confederate cavalry near Fredericksburg. This left James Wilson's cavalry division as the only force scouting ahead of the Union movement. Worse yet, Wilson hadn't sent any of his troops along the Orange Turnpike ahead of Governor K. Warren's 5th Corps. Ewell's Confederate infantry, led by Edward Allegheny Johnson's division, screened by North Carolina cavalry, made contact with part of Warren's corps, troops under the divisional commander of Charles Griffin. Warren informed Meade of the encounter, and Meade ordered a push against the entire line, hoping to buy some time for the rest of the army to come up. While Ewell was marching east along the Orange Turnpike and digging in around Saunders Field, Hill's corps was marching in the same direction on the Orange Plank Road. The only thing standing in his way was a small cavalry force left there by Wilson. Hill's lead division under Henry Heath threw out William Kirkland's brigade to drive back the Union horsemen. The fight was particularly bloody because the cavalrymen were armed with Spencer repeating carbines, which put up a steady fire into the slow-moving battle line of Kirkland. The 5th New York Cavalry lost and then regained Parker's Store, a vital road junction, before Crawford's division approached the junction. However, they didn't attack. They instead found good ground and waited. At the same time, part of Wilson's cavalry under Colonel George H. Chapman engaged with Confederate cavalry under Brigadier General Thomas L. Rosser. The cavalry battle raged with the Gray troops launching a couple of charges, but were ultimately driven back. Within Warren's corps, chaos was reigning. He was attempting to follow Meade's orders, but his divisions were not properly aligned. Griffin, Wadsworth, and Crawford had large gaps between their lines, and Warren wanted them filled. So he ordered Crawford to move to the right to connect with Wadsworth's left, but Crawford, hearing heavy gunfire to his front, didn't want to risk the movement. Griffin at Saunders Field was ordered to move against the Confederate position, but didn't want to attack across the open field. Before the movement across the Rapidan, Grant pledged to Meade that the Pennsylvanian would fight the campaign in his own way. However, Grant became restless as he expected fighting to occur, but nothing was materializing. At least nothing to any significant degree. He began to ride along the roads over which the Union Army marched and found Ricketts' division of Sedgwick's 6th Corps by the Rapidan River. Here he broke his pledge and ordered Ricketts to the front, not aware that Meade had ordered Ricketts to guard the right flank. Grant also ordered Horatio Wright's division to the Orange Turnpike. Feeling that that area was now going to be secure, Grant and Meade turned their attention toward the Orange Plank Road. Hill's troops were heading east, and his lead division under Henry Heath pushed the Union cavalry toward the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road, another vital location. Grant and Meade took the last division of Sedgwick's corps under George Getty and sent it in that direction. The stage was now set for one of the largest battles of the American Civil War, the Battle of the Wilderness. By 11:30 a.m. on May 5th, Getty's division made it to the crossroads of the Brock Road and the Orange Plank Road, blocking Heath's division from gaining the vital location. Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade were becoming increasingly frustrated, particularly with Governor K. Warren's lack of aggression. Warren was called to Meade's headquarters, where Meade criticized him for not moving his corps forward and attacking Lee when ordered to do so. After the meeting, Warren told General Griffin's aide in harsh words to move that division forward at once. It was now noon, and Griffin was finally able to move his division out from behind the breastworks that the men threw up to protect themselves from rebel bullets. At about 1 o'clock, the Union regiments made it to the jumping-off point. The brigades of Romaine Ayres and Joseph Bartlett sent their first line of men forward toward the enemy. Halfway across Saunders Field, the volleys from the Virginians and North Carolinians ripped into their lines. Seeing the problems the first line was having, the second line was thrown in to give them support, but their flanks were unsecure. Miraculously, many of the regiments on the front lines were making it across the field, amid the hail of gunfire. When Leroy Stafford's Louisianians and Walker's Virginians fired deadly volleys into the flank of the U.S. regulars, it crumbled, leaving the 140th New York out front, awaiting the second line. Naturally, it gravitated to the left to connect with Bartlett's men. When Ayres' second line got into the field, the same destructive fire that eliminated scores of U.S. regulars did the same thing to the two Pennsylvania regiments. When they left, this only left the 140th and 146th New York regiments north of the Orange Turnpike. The Virginians were holding steady, but to the south the Iron Brigade, led by Lysander Cutler from Wadsworth's division, was coming to Griffin's rescue. The 7th Indiana from the Iron Brigade hit John M. Jones's flank, and it began to crumble under the weight of the attack. Each regiment began to fall like dominoes. As some of the Virginians passed Cullen Battle's Alabama Brigade, some Alabamians asked, "Is the whole army retreating?" A Virginian said, "Yes, we are all falling back to Mine Run. The whole army is." This was enough to send the 5th and 3rd Alabama headed to the rear with the Virginians. Now the Union regiments had a foothold on the Confederate line, but could they hold it? The dense forest and thickets prevented them from seeing the enemy, but the light resistance indicated that the Confederates were fleeing in their front. However, the attack had thrown each regiment into confusion as men lost contact with their units. As they moved forward like a large mob, they came into contact with John B. Gordon's Georgians, who had recently arrived at the location. On the Orange Turnpike, Ewell was attempting to hold his line together. He grabbed a flag, planted it on the turnpike, and yelled to an orderly to tell General Gordon to bring up his brigade. The Federal soldiers retreated back across Saunders Field. A battery of artillery remained on the turnpike in the middle of the field. The 3rd and 1st North Carolina advanced to lay claim to the prize, but Federal bullets erupted from the tree line. The Tar Heels couldn't stay out in the open long before they retreated. Before they left, they placed small flags on the cannons to tempt the Union regiments. It worked. The 9th Massachusetts advanced into the field to claim the guns, but the rebel bullets ripped into their ranks, producing 150 casualties in just a few minutes. The Bay Staters returned to their lines. The first attacks made by Griffin's division of Warren's 5th Corps ended in utter defeat, even though they initially gained some success. To the south, Wadsworth's division was attacking 2 brigades of Robert Rodes's division. The thick forest prevented either side from seeing the other. Men aimed at the smoke discharged from the rifled muskets. The Iron Brigade was working around the flank of Dole's Georgians, but Dole's men were holding steady, the trees giving them some shield against the Federal bullets. As it looked as though the Georgians were beginning to break, Gordon, whom Ewell had requested to move forward, advanced and hit the Iron Brigade, driving them east. The Georgians gave the famous rebel yell as they advanced through the thick forests of the wilderness. Gordon then split his brigade to deal with multiple threats. Parke continued east, pushing the retreating Midwesterners. The others moved south to help Daniel's brigade push back what was left of Rice's brigade. Samuel Crawford, the division commander whom Warren couldn't get to close up on Wadsworth's left flank, finally moved some troops in that direction. 3 regiments from McCandless's brigade of Pennsylvania Reserves made it to the field late. They cautiously moved through the thick underbrush that characterized the wilderness until they got to Higgerson's field. Part of Gordon's Georgia Brigade advanced across the field with the 61st Georgia hitting the flank of the partial Union Brigade. Hundreds of the 7th Pennsylvania Reserve were taken prisoners in this quick movement. The rest, along with the 11th and 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves, retreated in haste from the field. Warren's attack in the beginning stages of the Battle of the Wilderness had resulted in complete failure. General Griffin, outraged at the lack of support and the fact that he was ordered to make such a senseless attack, came to Meade's headquarters, finding Grant, Meade, and Grant's Adjutant General, John Rawlins, there. Griffin let loose a tirade, asking where his support was, and why he was asked to sacrifice his division in such a way. Grant and Rawlins were appalled at Griffin's comments. Rawlins suggested that Griffin be arrested. Grant agreed by saying, "Who is this General Gregg? You ought to arrest him." Meade had known Griffin for some time and replied to Grant, "It's not Gregg, but Griffin, and it's only his way of talking," and assured both Grant and Rawlins that Griffin was indeed a good soldier. When Grant leaned back and lit up a cigar, Griffin left the scene. So far, Lee's line had held on, but more attacks were about to be made. The battle had just begun, but so far, the Confederates had the advantage. The Union Army of the Potomac, although defeated in the fight around Saunders Field, reformed fairly quickly despite the heavy losses. Those casualties still in the fields and in the forests of the wilderness came under a new threat. The blast from the rifled muskets and cannons set fire to the forest. The wounded who could walk tried to make it to the safety of their lines, but those unable to move faced the horrific fate of burning alive. Worse yet, the men's cartridge boxes, full of black powder and lead, would set off explosions when caught in the flames, adding further injuries to the wounded. One soldier described the scene. The almost cheerful pop-pop of the cartridge boxes gave no hint of the dreadful horror their noise bespoke. Swept by the flames, the trees, bushes, and logs which Confederates had thrown up as breastworks now took fire, and dense clouds of smoke rolled across the clearing, choking unfortunates who were exposed to it, and greatly hindered the work of the rescuers. The clearing now became a raging inferno in which many of the wounded perished. The bodies of the dead were blackened and burned beyond all possibility of recognition. It was a tragic conclusion to this day of horror. But the day wasn't over yet. More fighting would be done amidst the flames in the wilderness. Near Saunders Field, the brigades of Horatio Wright formed up to deliver their own attack against the Confederate left flank. Colonel Emory Upton, on Wright's left flank, went to his corps commander, John Sedgwick, and his division commander, Wright, to inform them both that attacking across the open field in his front would be disastrous. Both agreed, and when the attack commenced, Upton would stay put as the brigades to his right advanced. It was about 3 p.m. when Wright's men stepped off. The thick underbrush, dense smoke from the fires, and charred remains of comrades made the journey difficult. Before they made contact with Edward Johnson's Confederates, the brigades of Leroy Stafford and James A. Walker came out of their entrenchments and attacked. The wilderness hid the Union regiments until a volley erupted, catching the right side of Walker's line by surprise. The 5th and 27th Virginia fell back, forcing the 4th Virginia to pull their line back to protect the flank of the comrades to the left. However, this exposed the left flank of Stafford's Louisianians. With gunfire hitting their flanks and the Virginians beginning to disengage with the strong Federal line, Stafford had no choice but to withdraw. The small 1st Louisiana rallied around Stafford as the brigade commander assured that all of his regiments left the field. He sent the 1st back with their comrades and turned to ride back to his lines when a bullet entered beneath his left armpit and severed his spine. Some of his soldiers brought him back to their lines and laid him against a tree, paralyzed from the shot. As he lay there, the 9th Louisiana, his old regiment, part of Hayes' brigade of Louisiana Tigers, marched past. One soldier recalled, "We passed poor Stafford lying under a tree on the side of the road, suffering terribly from his wound." To those who stopped to express their sympathy, he spoke encouragingly, urging them to fight to the last and expressing a perfect willingness to yield up his life for the glorious cause in which he had so long borne arms. Stafford would be brought to Richmond, linger for 3 days, then pass away. President Davis and the First Lady attended the funeral. Hayes and his brigade arrived on the field, poised to halt the Union attack. What he didn't know was that the Federal line had stalled out already, many of the regiments running out of ammunition. Not knowing this, Hayes was going to launch a counterstrike to stop the Union advance. The Stonewall Brigade under Walker was to go with him, but when the Virginians didn't move, Hayes sent a message to Walker reminding him of his orders. Walker promised to advance as well, but when Hayes moved out, Walker's men did not accompany them. The Louisianians found the Federal battle line that overlapped their own. They stood toe-to-toe with the enemy and exchanged gunfire until the bullets hitting their flanks caused them to waver and retreat back to the safety of the Confederate breastworks. One Union soldier recalled that when the Louisianians retreated, within minutes he could hear the clanging of bayonets and tin cups against rocks as the Southerners dug trenches to protect themselves. The crack of axes in trees and the crash of the trees hitting the ground signaled to the blue-coated soldiers that the enemy wasn't giving up. They were strengthening their position against another possible attack. One soldier described it best when he wrote, "The battle had raged furiously along the entire line. The rattle of musketry would swell into a full continuous roar as the simultaneous discharge of 10,000 guns mingled in one grand concert, and then after a few minutes become more interrupted. We would hear the wild yells which always told of a rebel charge, and again the volleys would become more terrible, and the broken, crashing tones would swell into one continuous roll of sound, which presently would be interrupted by the vigorously manly cheers of the Northern soldiers, so different from the shrill yell of the rebels, and which indicated a repulse of their enemies. Now and then the monotony of the muskets was broken by a few discharges of artillery, which seemed to come in as a double bass in this concert of death. But so impenetrable was the forest that little use was made of artillery, and the work of destruction was carried on by the rifle. In the headquarters of Meade and Grant, the differing command styles were trying on both Grant and Meade as well as their subordinates. Grant wanted to push Lee with what troops he had on hand, while Meade preferred to wait until his forces were concentrated before launching any attack. Earlier in the day, Grant had ordered Ricketts' division of Sedgwick's 6th Corps forward. Meade, before Grant's order, had ordered that division to guard the Army's right flank. In the confusion, Brigadier General James Ricketts did neither. It would be 4 p.m. before he would eventually go to the battlefield, and when he did, his division was split up, with one of his brigades under Brigadier General Truman Seymour going to the right flank to extend and reinforce the line there. Meade believed that now, with 2 of his corps ready on the right flank, that he could crush Ewell on the Orange Turnpike. This belief was reinforced when word came from a signal station that troops were seen leaving Ewell's lines and going to the Orange Plank Road, where General A.P. Hill and his corps were engaging with Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps. In reality, the troops moving in that direction were soldiers in Major General Cadmus Wilcox's division of Hill's own corps, simply going to reinforce his fellow division commander. The last year had been miserable for Truman Seymour. He had ordered the fateful charge of the 54th Massachusetts on Battery Wagner outside of Charleston, South Carolina, and he had been soundly defeated at the Battle of Olustee in Florida. Now he was back in the Army of the Potomac, not having been in that army since the Battle of Antietam. Now he occupied the far right of the Union Army at the Battle of the Wilderness. Sedgwick hoped to find Ewell's left flank and turn it with his entire corps, along with Warren's 5th Corps. When Seymour's brigade stepped off, no other brigade followed. Why none of the other brigades joined in the attack was unclear, and the men in Seymour's brigade were scared of what was ahead of them when they realized they were alone in this endeavor. Seymour was in the second line while Colonel J. Warren Kiefer commanded the front line. Kiefer halted his men outside the range of the rebels' rifled muskets and sent a messenger to Seymour informing him that they were alone in the attack and that the enemy overlapped both flanks. Word came back to Kiefer that he was to attack as ordered. Hoping that his original message hadn't got to Seymour, Kiefer waited. Then another message came, stating again, to attack as ordered. They attacked and confirmed what they already knew. Seymour's brigade hadn't attacked Ewell's flank. Gunfire rang out from all around the Federal brigade. Bullets whizzed by the poor men's heads and struck comrades all along the line. When the first line faded back, the second line took its place. It didn't fare any better. The Virginians of Brigadier General John Pegram and Hayes's Louisianians were well protected behind log breastworks and taking little damage, but causing horrendous damage to the Ohioans and Pennsylvanians. That line melted away too, leaving a layer of blue soldiers covering the ground. Kiefer was shot in the arm, but would survive. Pegram, riding behind his men and encouraging them, was shot in the leg and likewise would survive the wound. A Virginian remembered the horrors of the battle and the night that followed. Shall that terrible night ever be erased from my memory, the terrible groans of the wounded, the mournful sound of the owl and the awful shrill shrieks of the whippoorwill, the most hideous of all noises I ever heard on a battlefield after firing had ceased. The loneliness is of itself sufficient, and these birds seem to mock at our grief and laugh at the groans of the dying. Pen and words fail to describe the scene. So far, numerous attacks against Ewell's line had ended in failure. However, as attacks were made at Saunders Field, the corps of A.P. Hill was engaging with the corps of Winfield Scott Hancock over the intersection of the Brock and Orange Plank Road. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, Corps Commander A.P. Hill, and Confederate Cavalry Commander Jeb Stuart sat on their horses at the Widowtap Farm and discussed the developing engagement. With Richard S. Ewell being heavily engaged on the Confederate left, Lee knew that if his troops could get a hold of the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road, he could swing around and be in the rear of Ulysses S. Grant's army, forcing him to either turn his attention away from the Orange Turnpike or to retreat. Grant and George Meade sent the division of George Getty to that location to safeguard their flank and ordered Winfield Scott Hancock to hurry to that location to support Getty. Getty knew he needed a little more time before Hancock's corps would be ready to make their attack, so he attempted to delay Hill's corps. Getty assembled the 3 brigades he had immediately on hand, those under Frank Wheaton, Lewis Grant, and Henry Eustis, and sent them forward through the thick vegetation of the wilderness. South of the Orange Plank Road, Grant reported little to no resistance. Very few Confederate troops were south of the road, at least initially. North of the road, Cook and Stone's Confederate brigades threw out a strong skirmish line, but it was significantly lacking south of their position. Grant's troops, particularly the 3rd Vermont, were spread out before the harsh terrain. Confederate General Henry Heath recognized the lack of troops on his right and moved the brigade of Henry Walker, containing Tennesseans, Virginians, and Alabamians, to that sector. Walker's men did more than take up a position on Cook's right. They charged the men from Vermont, driving them back. As with many units in this battle, the approaches of the enemy were concealed, and the sudden appearance of such a large group of Confederates caused confusion in the ranks. After they drove Grant back, Walker formed his men on the right of Cook's line. They instantly began to dig in and throw up breastworks, anticipating a counterattack. As Grant's brigade was thrown back, the other 2 Union brigades stood 50 yards from their Confederate counterparts and fired volleys. One officer recalled, "The men aimed at the wall of fire and smoke in our front. The distance between the 2 lines was so short that under ordinary conditions we could have charged upon the enemy with the bayonet before given time to reload. But a bayonet charge under these conditions was nearly impossible. A line could advance only slowly and with great difficulty even when unopposed. Anything like a dash upon the enemy was simply out of the question. Many of Getty's men were laying down to load and fire at the rebels. To stand up courted death. As ammunition became depleted, Wheaton replaced his front line with his second line, but despite the added fresh troops and full cartridge boxes, the Confederates weren't budging from their position. On the Union right, Eustis's 2nd Rhode Island crumbled under the weight of the enemy flanking fire. It retreated and began to reform behind the lines. Eustis now moved the 7th and 37th Massachusetts into the front lines. This new batch of soldiers laid down on the ground and kept up a steady fire, hoping that reinforcements would be coming soon. Union gunners brought up a section of artillery and unlimbered it on the road. They threw canister, solid shot, and case shot into the rebel lines. Quickly, a single Confederate gun approached the rebel line on the same road, but from the opposite direction. Each artillery crew began to fire canister at one another, causing death and destruction to the crews and horses. Many of the Union horses were killed in the duel, but they drove off the rebel gun. After the artillery duel ended, a stalemate emerged as neither side was given in. Brigadier General John R. Cook's brigade attempted to gain an advantage and advanced against Wheaton's troops. The rebels captured the guns sitting on the Orange Plank Road, but after a momentary success, the Federal regiments quickly recaptured the guns and the stalemate resumed. Hancock got word from Meade that he wanted the 2nd Corps to reinforce both of Getty's flanks and keep the rest of the corps in reserve. The developing engagement challenged Hancock's ability to follow orders, but he would endeavor to support Getty the way Meade had intended. First, he sent part of John Hobart Ward's brigade to the left of Grant's line. Grant, a capable brigade commander, asked the commander of the 5th Vermont if he could take the Confederate position in his front, since it appeared weak. The commander of the 5th thought for a moment and said, "I think we can." He then asked the 2 regiments from Ward's brigade, the 20th Indiana and 40th New York, if they would join. They all declared that they would take the position. The 3 regiments charged and hit Walker's line, caving in part of it and capturing the flag of the 55th Virginia. However, the Federal regiments got pushed back by the rest of Walker's regiments. Because of the Confederate line overlapping Getty's entire line, he needed additional support on the right. The engagement that started between the divisions of Henry Heath and George Getty was now gathering more troops toward the intersection. Hancock ordered the brigades of Alexander Hayes, Robert McAllister, and William Brewster to prepare to advance. 2 of Hancock's divisions were forming for an attack. Likewise, Heath extended his line to the right with the 11th North Carolina from William Kirkland's brigade. 2 Union brigades on the Confederate right were now poised to slam into Heath's line at a near perpendicular angle. What happened next has never fully been explained or understood by the participants or historians. Mott's division rushed forward, stamping over and through the dense underbrush, and made contact with Heath's line. However, as determined as they marched, the battle line gave way in a domino effect once they hit the Confederate battle line. One officer believed that since a large portion of the soldiers' enlistments were up in a month, many didn't want to die so close to getting out of the army. Some of the men claimed that Confederate forces were hitting their flank and rear, so that could mean that part of the 11th North Carolina had been dispatched to hit the flank, but it couldn't have been a huge amount of men. Either way, the brigades retreated across the Brock Road, securing themselves behind the hastily thrown together breastworks that they had completed before being ordered into the fight. However, the rest of Ward's brigade and Hayes's brigade were approaching Heath's line. The 1st U.S. Sharpshooters, also known as Berdan's Sharpshooters, were the skirmish line for Hay's brigade. As they and Ward approached the Confederate line, a destructive volley rang out from the rebel breastworks. One New Yorker remembered, "The woods light up with the flashes of musketry as if with lightning, while the incessant roar of the volleys sound like the crashing of thunderbolts." A member of the 3rd Michigan recalled, "The slaughter is fearful, men fall on every side, and my flag is receiving its share of bullets. Charge after charge is made by each side. Sometimes we drive the enemy, and then they rally and drive us, until both sides are exhausted, and night puts an end to our first day's struggle." Another soldier commented, "Brave men are falling like autumn leaves, and death holds high carnival in our ranks." Members of the 63rd Pennsylvania were laying down, obviously shaken by the horrific engagement. Hayes rode over to his old regiment to give them encouragement when a bullet struck his temple. His troops would carry him behind the lines in a blanket, and he would die a few hours later. His brigade would be taken over by John Crocker. Ward's men swung to attack Walker's men south of the Orange Plank Road and bolstered Grant's tired but tenacious troops. Heath would now commit the rest of Kirkland's brigade, sending them to various points in his line that he deemed weak, or to replace regiments who were out of ammunition. The 1 division under Heath had battled against elements of 3 different divisions and were holding on and even launching counterattacks. Part of Wheaton's brigade was forced to fall back for lack of ammunition, so the battle line that Hancock came to support needed to be patched. Hancock ordered John Gibbon to bring his division up at the double quick and ready them for an advance. Hancock was having to feed his men in piecemeal, but that's all he could do. If he hadn't, the Confederates could have overwhelmed Getty early in the engagement. He couldn't wait until all of his men were up before attacking. With the situation becoming critical for Heath's men, Hill and Lee dispatched 2 brigades from Cadmus Wilcox's division to Heath's front. Before they left, at the Tuning Farm, the brigades of Samuel McGowan and Alfred Scales were led in prayer by the chaplains. One soldier remembered, "On the left thundered the dull battle. On the right the sharp crack of rifles gradually swelled to equal importance. Above was the blue, placid heavens. Around us a varied landscape of forest and fields, green with the earliest foliage of spring, and here knelt hirsute and brown veterans striving for another struggle with death." The movement of Wilcox's men was discovered by the Union signal station, and Meade and Grant sent orders for Wadsworth's division to attack the Confederate left on the north side of the Orange Plank Road. Back in that sector, Grant and Wheaton's brigade had fired some of their last shots and needed rest and refitted. Hancock formed Samuel Carroll and Joshua Owens' brigades on either side of the Plank Road so they could replace the 2 tired brigades on the front line. As Grant pulled his right 2 regiments back so they could be replaced, Walker's Virginians charged their position, and Grant fell back. At this same time, the brigades of Scales and McGowan were ready to replace the weary troops of Heath. When Carroll and Owen attacked, so did Scales and McGowan, with the fresh rebel brigades advancing over the breastworks of Heath's men. Cook and Kirkland retreated to regroup and get resupplied with ammunition. Both sides battled in this lush terrain until the Confederates settled back into the breastworks prepared by their comrades. Stone on the left of Heath's line hadn't been relieved yet, but it needed to be soon. Many of his men fixed bayonets because they had no ammunition. Many of the Mississippians hoped that it wouldn't come to defending themselves with the bayonet, but they were prepared to do so if ordered. Luckily for them, Edward Thomas's Georgians would replace the beleaguered brigade. Hancock was a little cautious in the wilderness because he couldn't see the enemy's line or know its strength. Plus, it was difficult to attack the flanks because of the dense underbrush and swampy terrain. Nevertheless, he was attempting to overlap the enemy's flanks. A.P. Hill informed James Lane, whose North Carolinians were about to take up a position on the Confederate right, that Scales's men had become too disorganized in the attack and needed to fall back to reform, so Lane was to take their spot. Lane did as he was told. His men attacked the approaching 2 brigades under Nelson Miles and Thomas Smith. As he engaged with the approaching Federals, Wilcox pulled McGowan away from the front line to reform in the rear. This exposed Lane's brigade to flanking fire. Add on to that, John R. Brooks' brigade to the south had sent the 64th and 66th New York north to attack the Confederate flank. Lane was now by himself and surrounded by Union brigades. The only thing that saved Lane's men was the fact that they had thrown up some stiff resistance, and darkness began to cover the battlefield. In the darkness, Wadsworth's division approached from the north. Hill only had 1 unit available to combat this division, the 5th Alabama Battalion. Hill ordered the Alabamians to advance, screaming at the top of their lungs. When they did, the darkness and the sounds of shrieking rebel yells coming from that darkness halted Wadsworth's division. He had already been bloodied at Hickerson's Field, and the men stopped in their tracks. An historian of the battle summarized the fighting on Hill's front on May 5th succinctly when he wrote, A.P. Hill's battle farther south, however, was one of the war's most brilliant defensive efforts. There, the 7,000 men of Heath's division fought to a standstill a similarly sized 6th Corps division, Getty, followed by one assault after another from General Hancock's 2nd Corps, altogether some 30,000 men. Darkness covered the battlefield and gave the soldiers a few hours of respite after a horrific day of fighting. However, the Army commanders were planning for the next day's actions. A North Carolinian from Hill's Corps described the first day's fight as such. A butchery pure and simple it was, unrelieved by any of the arts of war in which the exercise of military skill and tact robs the hour of some of its horrors. It was a mere slugging match in a dense thicket of small growth, where men but a few yards apart fired through the brushwood for hours, ceasing only when exhaustion and night commanded a rest. A man from Lewis Grant's Vermont Brigade wrote, "Oh, you have no idea of the scenes we are passing through. Tongue can never tell the suffering, the hardships, the alternate rising of hope and falling of hope. The successes of the battle are various, though we have made steady gain from the first, which if our men last, will give us the victory in the end." Ulysses S. Grant sat at his headquarters that night and said, "I feel pretty well satisfied with the result of the engagement, for it is evident that Lee attempted by a bold movement to strike this army in flank before it could be put into line of battle, and be prepared to fight to advantage. But in this he has failed." However, Grant realized that James Longstreet's corps for Lee and Ambrose Burnside's corps for himself had not made it to the field. With fresh troops coming to the side of the fighting, more bloodshed would happen the next day. Grant's strategy was for Winfield Scott Hancock and his 2nd Corps, along with Getty's division from the 6th Corps, to attack A.P. Hill's corps and drive it back, defeating it before Longstreet could make it to the field. The 5th and 6th Corps under Governor K. Warren and John Sedgwick would hold Ewell in place so that Robert E. Lee couldn't shift troops to Hill's front. Hancock's attack was initially scheduled for 4:30 a.m., but Meade and some other generals convinced Grant to extend the time in order for Burnside to make it to the field. Burnside's corps was one of the key components for the fighting on May 6th. The 9th Corps would take up a position in the Union center, with one division being sent to Hancock to be used as a reserve. Lee put forward his plan for the night and the next day. Hill would move his corps north to link up with Ewell, while Longstreet came up and took the place of Heath and Wilcox's division. But Hill didn't prepare his men for the next day, just in case Hancock renewed the attacks. Why remains uncertain. If Hill did fill out a report, it has been lost. Heath's account remains the only good source on the situation, but his is suspect because it appears his intention was solely to absolve himself of blame. Heath claimed that he and Wilcox approached Hill to ask that their lines be reformed. Hill waved it off and said reforming in darkness so close to the enemy's lines was dangerous, and leaving the area meant leaving the wounded, so they should stay where they were. Hill added, "Longstreet will be up in a few hours. He will form in your front. I don't propose that your division will do any fighting tomorrow. The men have been marching and fighting all day and are tired. I do not wish them disturbed." Allegedly, Heath came to Hill 3 times requesting to reform the lines, and on the last one, Hill angrily stated, "Heath, I don't want to hear any more about it. I don't want them disturbed." In that respect, Hill was just following Lee's orders for his men to rest until Longstreet arrived to relieve them. Heath also made a ridiculous claim that he spent 2 hours searching for General Lee to go over Hill's head and claimed he could not find the army commander. The reason for this ridiculousness was Lee's headquarters sat right behind Heath's division, and Lee was in his tent all night, so Heath's story remains highly suspect. Ewell on the Confederate left was more active in aligning his troops from the day's fight. He switched brigades around and filled gaps in the line where needed. Although numerous Union brigades attacked his front, for the most part his line held and he threw back any blue troops. He also massed his artillery around Saunders Field and on each flank, where they could be used most effectively. Around 5 a.m. on the Union right, heavy skirmishing erupted between the forces north of Saunders Field, but no major attacks were made. The Union commander George Meade wanted Warren to make a vigorous attack against the Confederate line on the Orange Turnpike to prevent reinforcements to be sent from Ewell's line to Hill's, but Warren wouldn't budge. His skirmishers did move out, but no substantial attack was made. As Warren delayed, Burnside's corps was marching to the Union center. Hancock, hearing that Burnside was delayed in getting to him due to fires and clogged roads, grew angry, but was going to press on with his orders anyway. Hancock had worked tirelessly through the night to construct a battle line that was deep rather than wide. That way, proper support would be given to the front line. Wadsworth's division, with Henry Baxter's brigade of Robinson's division, was also on Hill's left flank, and poised for an attack as well. At a little after 5 a.m., the signal gun went off, signaling for Hancock's men to advance. The blue-coated soldiers pushed on through the dense vegetation toward the enemy. Many of the bushes and small trees had been cut down to around 2.5 feet due to the gunfire from the previous day, so the men moved through with a little more ease than the day before. When they made contact with the rebels, the enemy fired one volley and then began to break. Skell's brigade was one of the few intact brigades that gave any resistance, but with so many others around them falling back, they wouldn't engage with the Federals long. It wasn't long before Hill's 2 divisions were in full retreat toward the Whittletap Field. The only thing standing in the way of Hancock's 2nd Corps was the success that led to regiments, brigades, and divisions becoming entangled, especially the front line, and the 16 artillery pieces assembled in the Tap Field by William Pogue. Pogue remembered, "Closer and closer the uproar came, and I directed our men to pile up rails, logs, etc., at each gun for protection from bullets that now came constantly our way." The Federal soldiers caught up to many of the fleeing rebels and yelled for them to come behind their lines. They held their fire until those who wanted to surrender made it safely behind the battle line. A staff officer from General Meade came to Hancock at the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road. Hancock was overjoyed. He said, "Tell General Meade we are driving them beautifully. Birney has gone in, and he has just cleaned them out beautifully." The staffer informed Hancock, "I was ordered to report only 1 division of Burnside up, but he would attack as soon as he could." Hancock replied, "I knew it, just what I expected. If he could attack now, we could smash A.P. Hill all to pieces." Although Hancock's troops met with great success against Hill's men, his battle lines were now intermingled. One of his aides described the situation. Great gaps appeared in the line. Men and even officers had lost their regiments in the jungle. The advance had not been, could not have been, made uniformly right to left, and the line of battle ran here forward and there backward through the forest. Thousands had fallen in the furious struggle. The men in front were largely out of ammunition. One of those Federal soldiers said, "We had to break up into squads and march by the flank. Regiments would thus become separated from brigades and brigades from divisions, and when the attempt was made to reestablish a line, numerous gaps existed." Hill tried mostly in vain to get soldiers to reform. It was no use. By this point, no cohesiveness existed. Hill directed Pogue to fire double canister over the heads of the retreating Confederates at the Union troops pushing through the tree line. His staff worried that the artillery might hit wounded soldiers on the ground, but Hill simply stated, "The guns must open fire." Hill, the former artilleryman he was, began helping to load and fire the pieces at the Federal soldiers. Lee himself tried to rally Hill's troops retreating through the Whittletap Field. He came to General McGowan and said, "My God, General McGowan, is this splendid brigade of yours running like a flock of geese?" McGowan responded, "General, the men are not whipped. They only want a place to form, and will fight as well as they ever did." Union troops were now showing themselves through the trees. The artillery was keeping them at bay, but it wouldn't be long before the blue lines began coming in waves to overrun the 16 Confederate cannons. Lee was now incredibly worried. He told Cadmus Wilcox, one of Hill's division commanders, to ride along the Orange Plank Road, that Longstreet must be here. Go bring him up. It wasn't long after Lee sent Wilcox on his mission that he saw a group of men in formation heading east along the Plank Road. Lee asked, "Who are you, my boys?" The reply came, "Texas boys." Hood's old Texas Brigade, now under Brigadier General John Gregg, was now on the field. Lee took off his hat, waved it in the air, and yelled, "Hurrah for Texas! Hurrah for Texas!" The Texans deployed for battle in the Whittletap Field, with Lee close at hand. When the new arrival saw their army commander so close, they told him, "Go back, General Lee, go back." When Lee continued to follow them, they began to say, "We won't go unless you go back." Lee's aide, Charles Venable, made his appearance and informed the commander that Longstreet was needing orders. Lee turned his trusted horse Traveler around and rode to Longstreet. An Alabamian in William F. Perry's brigade, which was 2 brigades behind Gregg's Texans, described the scene. Directly in our front, as we were hastening forward, the sun, blood red from the effect of the smoke of battle, was just appearing above the wilderness. Litter bearers were continually passing with the severely maimed, and a stream of wounded, able to leave the battle line, filled both sides of the plank road. I never before or after witnessed such excitement and confusion. It was perfectly appalling. Staff officers were urging their mounts at topmost speed back and forth. Orders were repeatedly received for us to quicken our steps. The number of wounded and stragglers increased as we drew nearer the firing line, all stating that we were holding our own, unwilling to acknowledge that disaster had befallen them. Despite Lee seeing and interacting with the Texans first, the first brigade to reach the field was Joseph Kershaw's old brigade of South Carolinians, now under John Kennedy. They would file to the right of the Orange Plank Road. The Texans and South Carolinians advanced against the confused ranks of the successful Union regiments. Gregg's men stood 20 yards away from the enemy, with both sides firing volleys into one another. After only a short time, Gregg's brigade dwindled from around 800 men to just 250, losing nearly 2/3 of his command. They fell back, but another brigade, that under Henry Benning, was right behind to take their place. On the right, Kennedy's line drifted south, opening up a gap in the line. Joseph Kershaw, the division commander, would fill it with Benjamin Humphreys' Mississippians. Even though the Union lines were a confused mass, they were still able to defend themselves excellently. Their bullets found their marks, indicated by the fact that both Benning and Kennedy were wounded in the action, with John Hennigan taking over Kennedy's brigade and Dudley DuBose took over the command of the Georgians. The openness of the ground led the Union bullets, finding more targets in the Georgians' ranks. Behind DuBose was the brigade of William Perry, full of Alabamians. He had time to form up his brigade properly before setting off. General Lee, watching as the Confederates dressed their lines in preparation for the assault, commented, "God bless the Alabamians." When Benning pulled back, Perry's men went in with a rebel yell, pushing back more Union soldiers. Before he stepped off, Perry was told to keep his right on the Orange Plank Road and keep it there. If not, a large gap would form and threaten both Field and Kershaw's divisions. Perry did so, but they began to take fire from the woods to their left. If something wasn't done, then they would have to fall back too, just like Gregg and Benning. So Perry dispatched the 15th Alabama into the woods to hit the Union soldiers in the flank. Those Union soldiers to be subject to the flanking fire were 2 heavy artillery units, turned into infantry because of a need for more troops. The brigade made up of the 15th and 6th New York Heavy Artillery were huge compared to other units on the field. With just 2 regiments, the brigade outnumbered Perry's 5-regiment brigade 2-1. The 450 men in the 15th Alabama under William C. Oates charged the large regiments, causing them to scatter. The blue soldiers were inexperienced, mostly seeing guard duty around the defenses of Washington, D.C. The veteran Alabamians dealt with them quickly, losing only 1 man killed and 11 wounded. Along the road, the 4th and 47th Alabama ran into the single regiment of the 37th Massachusetts. The rest of the brigade, commanded by Eustis, halted, but the Bay Staters didn't get the order and advanced anyway. The blue soldiers fell back since they were alone and their flanks got overlapped by the rebel regiments. However, 3 regiments of Carroll's brigade attacked the Alabamians, driving them back to some breastworks thrown up by E.P. Hill's men the previous day. Carroll's men were now too far ahead of their own lines, and a quick counterstrike by Perry's men sent the Bluecoats back into the wilderness. To Perry's left, the 3 regiments on that flank were encountering stiff resistance. Oates again took the 15th Alabama to the flank of Wadsworth's brigades and fired repeated volleys into their flank. The gunfire was too much for the men, and the division began to give way. South of the road, Bryan, Hennigan, and Humphreys' brigades were advancing slowly, but pushing the Federals away from their sector. But Lewis Grant's Vermont brigade held on, even with their flanks pulling back. Some comrades across the road fired into the flank of Humphreys, which prevented them from being completely surrounded. Webb's brigade had emerged from the Brock Road, ordered to that sector, but couldn't find the units they were supposed to support. They ran into Perry's brigade and were sent back before they did any major fighting. A lull finally covered the battlefield as each side threw up breastworks. General Lee's army had been saved by Longstreet's corps making it to the field and throwing back the Federal attack on the Plank Road. However, the day was young. It was just a little after 8 o'clock, and there would be more fighting to do. Winfield Scott Hancock's attack in the early morning of May 6th met with initial success, but when Longstreet arrived, many of his brigades were thrown back. Some of the units were badly bloodied and needed to be replaced. One of Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps divisions arrived to give Hancock support, that under Brigadier General Thomas Stevenson. Hancock now became worried about his own left flank because more of Longstreet's brigades were arriving as time ticked away. Hancock began assembling a defensive line on the Brock Road to defend his position when Longstreet continued to press his front. To stabilize his front line, Hancock sent the brigade of Sumner Caruth of Stevenson's division to the front. Hearing gunfire to his south, he feared that Longstreet may be moving further south and attempting to turn his flank, so he dispatched Daniel Leisure's brigade down the Brock Road to Todd Tavern. What he actually heard was an engagement between Confederate Cavalry Commander Jeb Stuart and Union Cavalry Commander Philip Sheridan. Colonel Paul Frank's New York Brigade was also sent to the front, to the south of the Orange Plank Road. Frank and Robert McAllister didn't care for one another, and when Frank informed McAllister that he was going to move through his men to attack the Confederates in their front, McAllister refused to allow them through. When Frank attempted to go around McAllister, he ran into the brigade of Goodbrine and his Georgians. The New Yorkers, alone on the front lines, quickly retreated before the gray-clad enemy. Longstreet was gaining reinforcements all morning. Behind Charles Field and Joseph Kershaw's divisions was the 3rd and final division of A.P. Hill's corps, that under Richard Anderson. General Robert E. Lee's chief engineer, Martin L. Smith, reconnoitered the Federal left flank to see if any advantage could be found. He came back with word that an unfinished railroad cut belonging to the Fredericksburg and Gordonsville Railroad would give Longstreet's troops a perfect avenue along which he could move his men and strike the Federal flank. Longstreet chose his chief of staff, Moxley Sorrell, to lead the attack. Sorrell would command George Anderson's brigade of Field's division, William Wofford's brigade of Kershaw's division, and William Mahone's brigade of Anderson's division in this endeavor. Sorrell remembered that Longstreet said to him, "Colonel, there's a fine chance of a great attack by our right. If you will quickly get into those woods, some brigades will be found much scattered from the fight. Collect them and take charge, form a good line, and then move your right push forward and turn it as much as possible to the left. Hit hard when you start, and don't start until you have everything ready. I shall be waiting for your gunfire, and be on hand with fresh troops for further advance." Sorrell rode away from the meeting, feeling that no greater opportunity could be given to an aspiring young staff officer, and I was quickly at work. The brigades of Anderson, Mahone, and Wofford were lined up in fair order and in touch with each other. It was difficult to assemble them in that horrid wilderness, but in an hour we were ready. The brigades filed off into the railroad cut, poised to hit the flank of the Union brigades forming Hancock's front line. Sorrell got in front of the 12th Virginia, took off his hat, and waved it above his head, saying, "Follow me, Virginians. Let me lead you." A member of the 12th Virginia remembered, "The gallantry of this officer on that occasion is as vivid to me now as if it had been but yesterday. I do not remember to have seen during the whole period of the war a finer exhibition of prowess than I witnessed that day in Colonel Sorrell in the Battle of the Wilderness." Sorrell's men let out the rebel yell and slammed into the flank of Hancock's front line. McAllister had spotted the Confederates but couldn't get word fast enough to all the Union units before the attack came. At the same time, the rest of the brigades of Kershaw and Field were pushing forward. Some brigades attempted to turn and thwart the attack, but the bullets hit in their flank from all different angles. It was hard to keep the men's spirits high and keep a cohesive battle line. One soldier remembered that he and his comrades were obliged to run to the right of the line as the rebels came in on our left flank. The ground was covered with the dead and wounded in indescribable confusion. Another soldier wrote, "My leg saved me. We had to leave our dead and wounded, retreat out of that place, leaving all that we had gained in the hands of the enemy." North of the road, Wadsworth and Getty attempted to hold off the Confederates advancing in their front. The 20th Massachusetts was sent forward to hopefully blunt the rebel attack, but the concealed Confederates let loose an unsuspecting volley, which drove the Bay Staters back. Sorrell's attack force was pushing toward the Plank Road, which put the Union brigades on the north side of the road in a dilemma. Being hit from two sides, they decided to fall back to regroup on the Brock Road. The 12th Virginia of Mahone's brigade crossed the Plank Road and realized they were now separated from their brigade. It turned back toward the road, marching toward their fellow regiments. The dense forest obscured who they were to the rest of Mahone's regiments. Unsure of who was approaching them, the rebels south of the road began to fire on their comrades. at the same time that General Longstreet and his staff were riding down the road. It wounded and killed many in the party, including Longstreet, lifting him off the saddle and bringing him down hard. He was taken to the rear with a worried Robert E. Lee looking on. One Union soldier recalled the scene when Longstreet's troops slammed into them. My regiment was caught up as by a whirlwind and broken to fragments, and the terrible tempest of disaster swept on down the Union line, beating back brigade after brigade, and tearing to pieces regiment after regiment, until upwards of 20,000 veterans were fleeing, every man for himself, through the disorganizing and already blood-stained woods, toward the Union rear. Hancock would comment to Longstreet after the war, "You rolled me up like a wet blanket." Lee was now on the field to assess the situation. The rebel brigades were disorganized and needed to reform, so he called off going on the offensive at the moment, but did move his men forward to be ready to strike Hancock's line. Some of the last to leave the Winnowtap field were the brigades of Abner Perrin, William Perry, and Edward Perry. As they moved through the wilderness, they began to encounter Union troops on their left. Not expecting this, confusion went through the ranks, particularly William Perry's brigade. He sent the 48th and 15th Alabama regiments to investigate. The troops in that sector were two brigades from Burnside's corps, Potter's division. Ulysses S. Grant had been pressuring Burnside all morning to assist Hancock, and now, at a little after 1 o'clock, Burnside's troops were now hitting the flank of Longstreet's line. William Perry soon realized that there were more Federals than could be dealt with by his two regiments, and fronted the entire brigade northward. The Alabamians threw up breastworks the best they could. A Pennsylvanian wrote, "The movement was made through a dense wood, almost impenetrable owing to the entangled underbrush. The attack was made where it was utterly impossible to see anything from the thickness of the woods. The enemy was posted on the opposite side of a swampy ravine, behind entrenchments." One of his comrades recalled that those entrenchments or breastworks were made up of felled trees and the bodies of their dead. Edward Perry's Floridians faced north as well to confront the Yankees. The Florida Brigade numbered roughly 500 men, and when Zanus Bliss's brigade struck their line, it caved in. At about the same time, the 15th and 44th Alabama attempted to counterattack Bliss's right flank, but the tired Southerners couldn't budge the blue troops. William Perry's Alabamians held up against the fresh troops, but some Union soldiers were making their way into the Confederate breastworks. Reinforcements needed to come quickly. Burnside observed the engagement and ordered Griffin's brigade in, as well as Hartranft. Griffin's men joined Bliss's troops, with some of the more disheartened of Bliss's soldiers falling back. The rebel brigades of Dudley DuBose, John Stone, and Nathaniel Harris were also coming to reinforce their comrades. A Union soldier remembered, "Sharp firing at very close range ensued, followed by a savage charge which brought the boys into the enemy's rifle pits in some places. Being unable to maintain the advantage gained, the troops fell back. Twice the charge was renewed, considerable ground was gained, but the enemy retained possession of their lines. When Perry's brigade couldn't stand any more, their comrades reinforced their line as they pulled back. The two sides battled over the breastworks thrown up by the Alabamians. A member of the 36th Massachusetts remembered, "The regiment was loath to give up the great advantage it had gained, and the fighting was hand-to-hand, terrible and bloody. The men fought gallantly, but the force upon our left was too strong, and our line was compelled to retire, falling back slowly, with their faces toward the enemy. Finally, Burnside was able to stabilize his line, but with both sides exhausted and running low on ammunition, the battle drifted into a lull on Burnside's front. To the west, Longstreet's troops would soon attack Hancock's men assembled on the Brock Road. The appearance of Longstreet at the Winnowtap Field had saved Lee's Army of Northern Virginia that day and pushed Hancock's troops back to their stepping-off point on the Brock Road. Lee's strategy of keeping Grant and Meade in the wilderness to nullify their superiority in numbers had worked incredibly well so far by limiting the movements of Union forces and concealing his own movements. Winfield Scott Hancock had nearly one half of the entire Union Army of the Potomac under his command on the Union left, entrenched on the Brock Road, prepared to throw back any attempt by Longstreet's corps to take the intersection. Hancock's defensive line was a patchwork of sorts, and although it was deep, it was not organized enough to launch an attack or counterattack. It was around 4 p.m., and although the Battle of the Wilderness began around Saunders Field, most of the action had taken place on the Union left. One of General George Meade's staffers reconnoitered the Union front in that sector for the Army commander, and concluded that the front was clear of Confederates. The staffer couldn't have been more wrong. The dense foliage concealed at least 8 Confederate brigades waiting on word to move forward. To see what was in his front, Hancock dispatched Daniel Leisure's brigade to the front, beyond the secure entrenchments of the Brock Road. When the Union regiments sallied forth, the rebel brigades made themselves known to Leisure, but no major action would occur between the lone Union brigade and the front-line Confederates. Leisure returned to the entrenchments and informed Hancock that there were definitely enemy troops in their front. It wasn't long after Leisure returned to the Union lines that the Confederate brigades attacked Hancock's line. Although the 2nd Corps historian who was present at the battle believed it was an aggressive attack, he didn't believe it was an overwhelming one. However, the men on the front line for the 2nd Corps believed otherwise. One Union soldier described the attack as impetuous and persistent, the most wicked assault thus far encountered, brief in duration, but terrific in power and superhuman momentum. A member of the 1st Massachusetts recalled, "The enemy's first line, broken and wavering under the galling and repeated discharges of the Union infantry, was strengthened and steadied by the 2nd, and this again by the 3rd, both sides loading and firing in furious haste, till the rattle of at least 50,000 muskets rose into an incessant roll and roar, and all the space between the combatants was swept by a perfect hurricane of death-dealing missiles. The enemy was losing fearfully, and the Union troops behind their earthworks slightly." The attack mostly came from south of the Orange Plank Road, from the brigades of John Bratton, formerly Micah Jenkins's brigade, and George Anderson's brigade. The weight of the Confederate attack became too much, and the Union line broke, with the Georgians and South Carolinians surging into the breach, where hand-to-hand fighting began to erupt. Flames leapt from the pile of logs that formed the breastworks, and chaos began to run rampant through both ranks. Robert E. Lee had split Hancock's line in the center, near the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road, but the lack of support and the fact that Hancock quickly began to rally his men doomed this initial success. Leisure's men fixed bayonets and charged into the breach with their commander yelling, "Now, boys, show them what the anchor and cross cannon mean," referring to the Corps badge for the 9th Corps. Brooks' brigade came out of the line and hit the Confederates from the south, further weakening the hold that the Georgians had on the entrenchments. Finally, Carroll's brigade swept around and slammed into the flank of the South Carolinians. A member of Carroll's brigade remembered, "General Carroll made us a fiery speech and led us on the enemy. In a very short while we hustled them out of their position, taking a good many prisoners." With Union regiments converging on all sides, the 2 Confederate brigades pulled back, unable to capitalize on their initial success. The other brigades on the Confederate front lines made attacks, but none the size, scale, or success of Anderson and Bratton's attacks. After those initial attacks were pushed back, the fighting died down on the Union left, as both sides reorganized and collected their dead and wounded. May 6 was a busy time for a brigade commander in Jubal Early's division of Ewell's 2nd Corps. The young brigade commander was John Brown Gordon. Especially at Gettysburg, but even in the battles previous to that one, Gordon's reputation as a trusted and aggressive commander was touted throughout the Army of Northern Virginia. On the morning of May 6, Gordon sent out 2 scouting parties and personally reconnoitered the ground in front of him. He found that no Federals were in his front. Learning this valuable information, he believed that if he could put an attack force perpendicular to the Union line, he could sweep down the Federal ranks and roll up the entire Union right flank. As he said, as each of Sedgwick's brigades gave way in confusion, the corresponding Confederate brigade, whose front was thus cleared on the general line, was to swing into column of attack on the flank, thus swelling at each step of our advance the numbers, power, and momentum of the Confederate forces as they swept down the line of works and extend another brigade's length to the unprotected Union rear. Gordon sent an aide to find Jubal Early, his division commander, but instead found his corps commander, Richard Ewell. Soon Early arrived and heard the aide tell of Gordon's plan. Early shook his head and said that the last reports indicated that there were troops on the Germanna Plank Road, and even if the attack was launched, there was no reserves in case the Union troops counterattacked. The aide informed Gordon of Early's comments, and Gordon became enraged that Early dismissed his plan. Gordon personally had rode behind Union Corps Commander John Sedgwick's line and saw that no Federals were in that sector. Gordon personally rode to Ewell and pleaded his case, but it was dismissed again. At 1 p.m., Gordon again went to Ewell, but his case was denied again. After 2 p.m., Gordon received word that he should prepare for his planned attack. According to Gordon, General Ewell spoke to General Lee, and Lee authorized it, but the details are still unclear. Gordon was to use his brigade and the newly arrived brigade of Robert Johnston, full of North Carolinians. Gordon and Johnston were supposed to form a 2-brigade-long battle line, but instead of going to Gordon's left, Johnston remained behind Gordon. It was after 5 p.m. before all the units were ready. Ewell also wanted the attack to come at sunset to cause more disorder in the Union ranks and to magnify the amount of troops in the 2 brigades. It was around 6 p.m. when Gordon's men crashed into the Union flank. One Georgian remembered, "We found them massed 5 or 6 lines deep, all resting, cooking, and eating, with their guns stacked, their blankets spread down, and some of their little tents stretched." Another remembered, suddenly and only a few feet away, a long line of gray-clad soldiers appeared and opened on them. Never was lightning from the clouds more expected, and confusion reigned supreme. A New Yorker on that flank remembered, "The enemy came up suddenly with a terrific yell and jumped over and around the shallow works in front, throwing this gallant regiment into a rout before the members had time to grasp their muskets from the stacks." The 122nd New York made one of the most determined stands of the assault, but they, like all the rest, fell back amid the hail of gunfire coming from their flank. One Union officer described the scene. "Such excitement you could form no idea of. Staff officers yelling and calling on men to rally, and the men throwing away their guns and running like madmen. And them Rebs a-yelling as they came up on the charge with that peculiar yell they have." The success of Gordon's attack created confusion in Gordon's own line. The regiments were disordered, and Johnston's brigade, seeing some Union soldiers rallying on his left, retreated, leaving Gordon basically alone. Hoffman's Virginians had moved out of their entrenchments, but only 2 regiments, the 58th and 31st Virginia, made an attack. Some Virginians mistakenly fired a volley into Gordon's brigade, which caused even more disruption in the attack. The Virginians made it to the breastworks of the enemy, but a heavy volley sent them to the rear. The Virginians made it to the breastworks of the enemy, but a heavy volley sent them to the rear. Seeing the attack fall apart, Gordon rode over to the rest of Hoffman's Virginians with his hat in his hand and tears in his eyes, begging the rest of the brigade to move forward. When they and Gordon's men advanced, they now ran into stiff resistance, as officers had been able to rally men as well as dispatch more troops to that sector. The darkness was also stalling the attack as the Virginians and Georgians lost unit cohesion as they moved through the woods. A Virginian wrote, "We thought we saw men lying on the ground to our front and supposed them to be our skirmishers. We marched up to them when they raised up and put their guns almost against our heads and fired." By 10:30 p.m. the attack was over, and the units went back to their respective sides. Other than some skirmishing, the Battle of the Wilderness now came to an end. Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter, an aide to General Ulysses S. Grant, described the engagement. "Forest fires raged, ammunition trains exploded. The dead were roasted in the conflagration. The wounded, roused by its hot breath, dragged themselves along with their torn and mangled limbs in the mad energy of despair to escape the ravages of the flames, and every bush seemed hung with shreds of blood-stained clothing. Over the 2 days of battle, the Union lost 17,666 men, 2,246 killed, 12,037 wounded, and 3,383 captured. The Confederacy lost 11,033, 1,477 killed, 7,633 wounded, and 1,923 captured or missing. The battle had been horrendously bloody, with each army losing around 17% of its fighting force in 2 days. Grant, new to the Eastern theater of the war, stated, "Joe Johnston would have retreated after 2 days of such punishment." Lee was a completely different commander than his Western counterpart. Grant would write to Henry Halleck and the Lincoln administration that, "At present, we claim no victory over the enemy, neither have they gained a single advantage. The enemy pushed out of his fortifications to prevent their position being turned, and have been sooner or later driven back in every instance. Up to this hour, the enemy have not shown themselves in force within a mile of our lines."